It's a great pleasure, sir, to be able to bring to the attention of this Parliament today a significant body of work by the African Communities Council of SA, who have recently released their report of their inquiry into youth violence and crime within African South Australian communities. This is a significant body of work that's been undertaken over the last year and some months by dedicated volunteers with some support from the government, which we're appreciative of. But indeed, the leadership shown by the African Communities Council in enabling this work to be undertaken has been very exemplary and a privilege to witness. The African Communities Council demonstrated leadership in identifying that this was a challenge for our community and one in which they could play a leadership role in addressing. The inquiry has been looking into the causes, challenges and potential solutions to violence and antisocial behaviours committed by African South Australian youth. The Leader of the Opposition, David Speers, the Honourable Jing Lee, Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs, and myself as the Deputy Leader were very pleased to meet with Mr Dennis Yengi, the Chair of the African Communities Council, Dr Yilma Wald-Gabriel, a psychologist, and Mr Siegfried Menz, the legal advisor. They were members of the working group from the African Communities Council who've been working on this report. They came into Parliament House, presented the key findings to us and talked about the journey that they had been on with the community to come up with this set of recommendations to make their community safer and our South Australian community safer. We were very pleased to receive that report. I also acknowledge the other members of the working group, Ms Jane Nyaketcho, Mr Steve Milstead KC, Ms Mary Ajang, Mr Mba Idikauduma, Mr Jur Deng, Mr Elias Kabura and Ms Amiok Wal. Look, one of the key insights that Dennis Yengi brought to our attention and on reading the report, it's right at the front of his foreword, is, and I'll quote, "It takes a village to raise a child" is a proverb that embodies the spirit of African cultures, which refers to responsibilities of the entire communities to provide for and interact positively with children and young people and help them grow in a safe and healthy environment. I continue to carry this core belief despite being raised, educated and acculturated here in South Australia. This proverb always reminds me of my communal values, to look beyond my own immediate kinship circles and to pay particular attention to the welfare and well-being of my African South Australian communities. And that is to his credit, sir, that he says so. The inquiry was prompted by several tragic incidents. The murder by stabbing of 25-year-old Nior Bol, originally of South Sudanese origin, here in Adelaide on the 25th of April last year. A mass brawl, including the use of knives and machetes outside the Nairobi Affair Lounge on Grenfell Street on the 13th of March last year, which resulted in 6 people sustaining injuries. And around that time, it was reported that 120 charges had been laid against several people of South Sudanese backgrounds. So, as the report states, African South Australian communities were shocked by these heinous crimes committed by some of their young people and have called for law enforcement bodies to hold perpetrators to account. Meanwhile, the African South Australian communities remain concerned about the far-reaching consequences of crimes committed by a small number of young people on the vast majority who are law-abiding and not involved in violence or criminal behaviour. And it is worth, sir, restating that point. We are talking about crimes committed by a very small number of people, a number of people that are not representative of the broader community. And it would have been easy, indeed many would have in their place swept that issue under the carpet because it is only a small number of people, as only a small number of people from other communities commit crimes, and their actions should nor be seen as representative of those broader communities. But the African Communities Council has demonstrated leadership and courage, sir. The working group conducted focus groups, surveys and engaged with government, specialists and the broader community. Hundreds of people made contributions to this work through those focus groups and surveys. Issues particularly identified by young people involved in the justice system, which were an important cohort to be interviewed, included stories of broken families, of individuals with low level of parental involvement, but not all of those cases had such. Some cited intergenerational conflict, the challenge posed in situations where young people retained fewer values from their native culture and more from mainstream culture, giving rise to arguments and disputes at home. Some young people, as of course in any community, fell prey to negative peer influences, falling in with the wrong crowd and doing the wrong thing. And some, and this is a particularly pertinent set of findings, which I found very interesting as a shadow education minister, a former education minister, were some people in the juvenile justice system citing challenging classroom environments. Students reporting that their journey off the rails may have begun with negative experiences within schools, bullying by other students, or indeed, concerningly, racial or cultural insensitivity from some teachers. Some students reported difficulties beginning with their limited language proficiency. These experiences highlight the importance of our educational system, not just relying on parents to prepare their children for schools, but for our schools and our systems to be prepared for the children who they serve. We know, sir, that most of our schools, all of our schools, and the overwhelming majority of our teachers absolutely dedicate their lives to serving students in the best way that they can. And indeed, some schools have greater deals of complexity than others. Some schools are harder environments for a teacher who might not have had experiences in the past in dealing with certain circumstances to do so. And it is incumbent upon us as a parliament, and indeed on the government of the day, whoever that is, to do whatever they can to provide support for those schools, to ensure that teachers, when confronted with complex situations, have every level of training to understand the needs of their students. Trauma-informed practice is increasingly dominant around our education system, and indeed that cultural engagement and the cultural engagement programs in place, I think, are very good. But there's always more work to be done, and it's been highlighted, I think, by these young people in juvenile justice who have brought it to the attention of the reviewers. Particularly, I've highlighted the insights from those youth involved in criminal justice system, but the report also presents valuable and interesting insights from other cohorts, from government and non-government service providers, from families and community leaders. The work culminates in 39 recommendations dealing with preventative actions, individual and family actions, and society-wide approaches. Some actions should be relatively straightforward, and I hope the government will pick them up quickly. Some will require further work or potentially funding to deliver. Some may be contested. There are some that the government, indeed some potentially that the Parliament might not agree with. But all are considered and have been considered and are worthy of further consideration by the government. We urge the government and we urge the Cabinet in particular to give them that consideration. This is not the responsibility of one minister alone, it is the responsibility of Cabinet, as I'll come to in a minute. Doing so gives due recognition to the work undertaken by ACSA, the African Communities Council of South Australia, and in particular its working group, and it pays due respect to the hundreds of South Australians who have voluntarily contributed to this body of work. A range of government departments and agencies will need to make a contribution to the government's response, including human services, police, courts, corrections, youth justice, education, and indeed the early years section within education, as well as small business and industry and economic development. Some recommendations will also benefit from engagement with the Commonwealth. Once again, so I commend the report to the House, and I urge all members of Parliament to familiarise themselves with it, and indeed thank once more the African Communities Council and the leadership of Denis Yengi and the team for doing this work, which hopefully will bear great benefits, not just for the African community in South Australia, not just for young people in the African community in South Australia, but indeed, sir, for our state as a whole.